Hello, my name's Reine DuBois, and I'm excited to be delivering this presentation on toxic mould and its effect on hormones. It's something I'm quite passionate about, and I've been working with toxic mould for about 15 years, and I feel like there's lots of known and understood, but the effect that toxic mould has on hormones, I feel is not that well understood, but is quite obvious in a lot of patients that I treat for chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this presentation is being delivered, the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to state that the knowledge that I'm sharing today has been accrued over working with a team, from the team collaboration, incredible integrative doctors and naturopaths, psychologists and osteopaths and acupuncturists. And it's really what's led me to have the in-depth understanding that I actually have of the endocrine system currently and the effect that mould has on it. So mould exposure affects various parts of the body, but I'm just going to be focusing on a few areas with this talk. I'm going to be looking at the thyroid function and how it's impacted on mould, estrogen excess, and all things associated with estrogen and mycotoxins. And I'm also going to be looking at cortisol and cortisol levels, and the adrenal fatigue part of this picture. This talk is very much about the pathophysiology, so just trying to understand the processes that are happening in the body. And I think it's super important to quote here that not all people are affected by mould the same way. People can be living in the same environment but present very, very differently. A lot is dependent on the duration of the exposure of the mould, what sort of mould we're dealing with, if you're male or female, and what your genetic predisposition is. So to start with, I'm just going to touch base on a couple of the really classic mycotoxins and just their associated effects they have on us. So aflatoxins is the first one that I want to start with. There's four major ones, but the B1, aflatoxin B1, is the one that's most well known, mostly for its carcinogenic properties. The aflatoxins are mostly produced from the aspergillus or aspergillus species. I say aspergillus. And quite often they come from contaminated foods that are then fed to cattle and chickens, and then we consume those. So sometimes we consume the foods directly, or sometimes we consume them indirectly. Now, aflatoxins also thrive in hot, humid climates. So this is one that we often see when our building biologists go in and check for specimens in the environment. Aflatoxins is one of them. Ochratoxins is another one, and it's a potent neurotoxic metabolite. Again, mostly comes from those aspergillus species, and it's found in barley, oats, rye, wheat, and coffee beans. And it can affect the liver predominantly, but it is also an immune suppressant. And then we've got your zearalenone. And this is the one comes mostly from the Fusarium species, and it has the most estrogenic type properties and can bind onto those estrogen receptor sites, which I'll go into further. And in some places it's been patented as an oral contraceptive because of its estrogenic-like effects. And this last one, trichothences, is a mycotoxin that's probably one of the most dangerous ones, and comes from the Fusarium, but also the Stachybotrys species, and it can affect your health on many levels. Now, this one mostly comes from water-damaged buildings, and you can't always see it. I know in this picture, it's pretty obvious that there's black mould in that house, but quite often it lives in the walls and you can't always see it. So as mentioned, we are exposed to these molds through contaminated foods. We can be exposed to them through contact of the skin and inhalation. And the classic example with inhalation is if you feel unwell at home, but you feel better when you go to work or school. Or if all of your symptoms improve when you go on holiday, and putting the vacation effect aside, all of the extreme symptoms improve, then there's a good chance you may be dealing with mycotoxins in your environment. So these are two tests that I do frequently to assess the level of systemic mycotoxins that could be affecting your hormonal system, amongst other systems. And both are very, very good tests. So let's start with the thyroid. So the mold exposure can affect the thyroid in a couple of different ways, but the main thing is it interferes with hormone synthesis and metabolism. And it can present as both hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, depending on the nature and the duration of mold exposure. And sometimes it'll start presenting as hyperthyroidism and then it'll move on to hypo. So a little bit of pathophysiology. The thyroid gland has two main hormones that it synthesizes, T4 and T3. Both of these hormones involve the uptake of iodine and tyrosine, and they're very much mediated by the enzyme thyroid peroxidase. So you can see in this little chart here, you've got the iodine here at the bottom, your tyrosine molecules here, and then your TPO, your thyroid peroxidase, is the enzyme that's very, very important in the whole action of thyroid, of T4 to T3. Now, what we found with some mycotoxins that they can really inhibit this TPO action, leading to a reduction in the production of T4 to T3. And this is considered as a hypothyroid state. The other thing that we often see and isn't as well understood is T4 can sometimes be converted into reverse T3, and this T3 is not active. And so mycotoxins can interfere with this conversion process. So instead of converting to T3, it converts to reverse T3 and can create this hypothyroid state, even though test results may appear normal. The thyroid hormones are also transported into the blood by proteins, and these are called thyroid binding globulins. And these proteins can be affected as well, altering the level of free thyroid hormone available because you haven't got these proteins to bind. Additionally, mycotoxins may interfere with the binding of thyroid hormones to their receptor target tissue. So we've got target tissues in the brain, in the skeletal, in the skeleton, in the skeletal muscles, in the fat tissue, in the liver. We've got them in the heart, and we also have them in the thyroid pituitary hypothalamic axis, so that feedback loop, which I'll talk about a little bit more when we get to cortisol. So I thought it was a good idea to put thyroid testing up. Quite often patients come and they've only tested the TSH, and this is pretty standard, and even the lab, sometimes if the doctor asks for free T3 and free T4, will only do TSH, and if it's not out of range they won't go on and test the other two, T3 and T4. So you may need to consider doing these privately. But just TSH on its own can't give you a lot of information. TSH, we really want quite a narrow margin. We want it to sit between 1 and 2. So you can see here, this lab range is way out. Some lab ranges go up to 3.5, and they have been getting altered over time. But we really want this between 1 and 2. This T4 level is actually quite good, 19.4. I'm very, very happy with that. And the same with the T3. Anything over 4, I consider is a good level of T3, and that very possibly this whole cascade of events is happening well. If you've got a TSH between 1 and 2, a T4 between 15 and 20, and a T3 over 4. The other thing that if you're considering could mycotoxins be affecting my thyroid gland is I think you need to have a look at the peroxidase and the thyroglobulins and if there's antibodies presenting or not. And quite often this testing isn't done if the TSH is within what's considered range. So maybe getting these done privately as well is a good idea. If you want a full thyroid picture and to be able to identify anything that may be happening thyroid, you need all of this information. So mycotoxins and estrogen excess. Now this is something I'm quite passionate about at the moment. And the main species, as mentioned before, is those coming from the Fusarium genus, and because they have the most estrogenic effect. And this means that they mimic estrogen. And a very common picture that we see is this estrogen dominance. So if we've got high estrogen, we'll see things like depression, low libido, anxiety. These are all estrogen excess pictures. Acne, hot flushing can be an estrogen excess picture. Lowered thyroid function, decreased muscle tone, increased cardiovascular disease, increased weight and cellulite, and fluid, increased fluid, which is a classic estrogen excess symptom. PMS, irregular periods, cramps, bloating, and breast tenderness is another classic estrogen excess picture. So due to the structure of estrogen, these mycotoxins in particular can sit in the estrogen receptors, and so they can dock onside the estrogen receptors and act exactly like estrogen in the body. And this can happen in men and in women. So women, as we mentioned before, can have all those premenstrual symptoms. The breast tenderness is a classic symptom, but heavy periods, fibroids, polyps. With men, we see a decrease in sperm quality and production. They may also get breast enlargement and erectile dysfunction. So if you're having some of those symptoms, I like to test for estrogen in men and women. If we suspect that mycotoxins are mimicking estrogen and creating these estrogenic effects. So I think it's important to touch on xenoestrogens. Xenoestrogens are molecules that can fit neatly into that estrogen receptor site but are not estrogen. But they can, once they're in that receptor site, they can signal like estrogen in the body. So there are our xenoestrogen type mycotoxins. The zearalenone is probably the most well known, and it has an effect on binding the estrogen receptors. The aflatoxins are more endocrine disruptors, and the ochratoxins as well are more endocrine disruptors. So other xenoestrogens, and I think this is a big problem that we're facing, is that we are swamped with xenoestrogens outside mycotoxins as well. So we're already getting them from our water, our cosmetics, our non-organic produce, plastics, which are well known now, chemicals like cleaning and laundry products, but they're in our sunscreens, the oral contraceptive pill, our furnishings that are off-gassing, even those receipts you get from the printer. So we're swamped with xenoestrogens. We're living in a sea of them. Our estrogen receptor sites are upregulated, and they're having to decide, is this estrogen from a healthy endocrine system, or is this an environmental? Heavy metals like lead has a xenoestrogen effect. So there's lots of xenoestrogens we're exposed to in the modern day life, and then add mycotoxins into the equation. We are living in a time of estrogen dominance. So some really good papers, xenoestrogens and the impact that it has on the brain estrogen receptor signaling, a precursor to neurological disease. And what this paper talks about is that xenoestrogens are extremely high in lipid solubility, which means that estrogen can dock onto the estrogen receptors and cross into the cell, but because they're lipid soluble, they don't even need a receptor. They can cross that membrane without the receptor and then dock onto the receptors inside the membrane. So estrogen is a very active hormone that has many ongoing reactions and influences on our RNA transcription. And another thing that I often see with xenoestrogens is they interact with sex hormone binding globulin. And this is something that I often test in my patients, the free androgen index. And like you can see with this example here, sex hormone binding globulin has been bound. There's something else sex hormone binding globulin is binding to, and sometimes it can be xenoestrogens, either xenoestrogens from mycotoxins or from plastics in the environment or the oral contraceptive pill. However, we usually see it go high if the oral contraceptive pill is binding, because the proteins, the sex hormone binding globulin proteins, increase to meet the demand of the pill. So when we see the sex hormone binding globulins is low, there's all this free testosterone because there's nothing to bind it with. And these are the patients that we see that have the classic PCOS presentation, the polycystic ovarian syndrome, with the high free testosterone. And it can be mycotoxins taking up those parking spots that the sex hormone binding globulins are making. Heavy metals can do that too, but so can our other xenoestrogens. So health consequences we've talked about. My classic symptom is that just excruciating breast tenderness, either in men or women, but mostly women. Fibroids, those heavy periods, endometriosis can be this as a consequence of mycotoxins, either docking on the estrogen receptor or moving inside the cell unopposed. And so the last bit to hopefully pull it all together for you is mycotoxins and cortisol. So cortisol is known as the stress hormone. And it is impacted by mold exposure. So the big thing is chronic exposure to mycotoxins can lead to adrenal fatigue and produce and interfere with the production of cortisol. This it takes us to the adrenal gland, and you can see it's this tiny little gland that sits on top of the kidneys, but it has so many jobs. So one of the main jobs is to produce the glucocorticoids, cortisol and cortisone, cortisol being the active, cortisone being the inactive. But it produces the mineral corticoids, aldosterone, it produces some androgen hormones, it produces estrogen and testosterone, it produces the catecholamines, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, and it produces peptides. So this tiny little gland has a lot of roles and responsibility. And if we start interfering with that cortisone production, it's going to take us then we can see the stress response that gets set up here. So its main role is to help with this stress feedback in the body, but it is also responsible for the metabolism, it's responsible for the immune, and it's responsible for inflammation regulation. So you don't want this little mechanism knocked out. You can see here the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal connection, and then the byproduct is cortisol. It's a whole feedback mechanism where the hypothalamus produces the hormone, the corticoid corticotropin releasing hormone, oh yeah, there it is, which stimulates the pituitary gland to make ACTH, which then stimulates the adrenal glands to make cortisol, which then feeds back to the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And this is a beautiful little loop that happens all through the day that keeps us functioning, keeps the immune system in place, inflammation, keeps us alert. And so what happens is mycotoxins can disrupt this pathway. Oxidative stress can ensue, but can also disrupt it as well. And so prolonged exposure to toxins and this pathway being knocked out creates a stress response that sometimes takes the body quite a long time to recover from. So let's look at ACTH. So quite often with ACTH, when this loop is first happens, we may see a patient have too much ACTH. And that's where you'll see a lot of upper body weight being put on, the face will go quite round. You get that fatty hump on the back of the neck, between the shoulders, thinning of the arms and legs. Stretch marks is another symptom where you see this high ACTH. But then what happens is over time, the ACTH levels will start to be low, which means there's no cortisol being produced and there's no feedback to the body to say we are out of this stress situation. So the body remains stressed through this process, but the fatigue starts to ensue. So the body doesn't actually have the energy to keep that little loop going. And this is where you see your adrenal fatigue, long-term fatigue picture. And there's stages to get to this part. But quite often, yeah, this is the fatigue where you just can't get out of bed. So the concept of adrenal fatigue due to long-term chronic stress is how we would explain the effect mycotoxins can have and can lead to that depleted adrenal picture. I think the most important thing, and we do test this through the Dutch test, the dried urinary test, and I like this little chart because it shows the hypothalamus signaling to the pituitary, which is signaling the ACTH to the adrenal gland, which is producing cortisol and producing DHEA. And we'll see cortisol and DHEA in varying levels as you move through that syndrome. So here's some results. This is a morning urinary cortisol at 133, so I would consider that low. And then you've got a DHEA of 16.3. So in this picture, the cortisol production has started to become low. So we would say the ACTH is probably reduced, but the body's producing DHEA as a result. And so this is an adrenal stress scenario where the body's trying to compensate with the DHEA. So the adrenals are producing something else to signal, not cortisol. And this picture is a 24-hour urinary cortisol collection. And you can see really with 24-hour urinary collection, we like it over 50. So, you know, back in Feb 21, the adrenals were hanging in there. They were making a decent amount of cortisol throughout the entire day. But then 22 and 23, those adrenals, that's quite low. So anything under 30 for me, I consider quite low. And then the DHEA is also low. So it tells me the other functions of the adrenals aren't working either. So the gland is very much under pressure, dealing with a lot of inflammation and possibly oxidative stress. So in this picture here, 2.8, 2.6, 2.3. Now we did pop them on a little bit of DHEA and we're now seeing that, but that's been supplemented now. So the symptoms of low cortisol, there's the hypothalamus and its byproducts that it's producing, the pituitary gland, and then the adrenal gland. When it can no longer produce cortisol, we'll often see fatigue. Dizziness is a classic symptom of this syndrome. Weight loss as well is a classic symptom, reduced muscle mass, but low blood sugars. So it's that thing when you stand up and they black out, if they miss meals, it goes bad really fast. It's almost what I would consider a POTS presentation, but it's complicated, and the drivers need to be identified in these pictures. And if they're mycotoxins, then we need to consider that and what's happening with the other parts of the endocrine system. So I haven't talked about treatments in this presentation, but I just want to touch on it briefly right here at the end. Diet is essential, and I would work with a clinical nutritionist. Quite often you need, I would recommend going away from grains, because most grains have a level of mold or mycotoxin on them. Nuts and seeds you need to be careful of, but as soon as you start doing a restrictive diet in these conditions, you do need to get some support to make sure you're eating enough of everything. Remove the source of the mold, and that's absolutely top of the list as well. And it's that thing that if you go away from the house and you feel better and you come back and you instantly feel sick, you may not be able to smell it, you may not be able to see it. Inquire about the property. Has this property flooded prior to me moving in? Removing the mold, the source of mold, working with a building biologist is absolutely essential, and they need to be a certified building biologist, not just somebody who thinks they know mold. Ask to see their certification. Consider other environmental toxins. Are there heavy metals? Do you have mercury amalgams? Are you microwaving your food in plastic? And supporting the liver and to metabolize the mold toxins. So binders are super important to consider. Restore those nutritional depletion. IV vitamin therapies go a long way in this picture. Herbal treatments, there's some brilliant herbal treatments for the endocrine support, just supporting the estrogen receptors, supporting the thyroid if it's under stress. Consider bioidentical hormones and thyroid extract. But another part of this is really rewiring the nervous system, because it is an incredibly stressful event for the body when you have had mycotoxin exposure, especially long term. Quite often patients have gotten out of the mold, they've changed their diet, we've repleted the nutrients, but the post-traumatic stress memory in the tissue holds it still in that stress response, and it's hard to get that adrenal repletion unless the nervous system is being rewired. And restore sleep and breathing practices, and it's why I have a biological dentist on the team, just to make sure we've got that sleep breathing apparatus working so that we can restore and recover. So I hope this information's been helpful. We're loving working together, and if you feel like you need help or that you've been exposed to mycotoxin, you're not sure, you've got some pathology, nobody can really make sense of it, maybe it's a good idea to get the pathology to somebody who does functional medicine or integrative medicine, because they'll have a very different interpretation of the same information, and it's just about reading between the lines.